Well, who is not? The story of the 12 apostles, part 4. Stories focusing on healings, miracles, and talking animals are really all about instructions to the apostles to reinforce Christian faith and win converts. Even heavens in Turkey couldn't resist John's call after witnessing the power of his prayers. He was able to cause the destruction of their temple, honoring the pagan in Goddess Artemis. These apocryphal acts then contain perhaps not historical truth, but at least very early traditions of our apostles. They do preserve useful historical information in defining where it was the apostles went for their missions and how and where they died. In stark contrast to the apocryphal display of acts of humor and redemption is the recurring theme of violence. From the 2nd to the 4th centuries, modern stories found in the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles were a source of great inspiration to early Christians systematically persecuted for their opposition to worship the emperor. Christians sustained their faith by reading about the apostles' heroism in the face of death. To know what kind of persecutions they lived with, to be bound and chained or crucified upside down or burned at stake gave those early Christians who were facing such difficult times courage to live their lives and to be even martyrs in some cases for the faith. The climax in each apocryph act is the testimony of faith given by the apostles as he is about to die. His desire for fellowship with Christ in God empowers him with fearlessness. The apostles, Andrew, Peter's brother, followed this tradition. In the Acts of Andrew, a Greek official sentences Andrew to death for converting his wife to Christianity. Instead of protesting, Andrew insists on being killed and twice refuses the opportunity to escape. During his crucifixion on an egg-shaped cross, Andrew urges the crowd of onlookers to be constant and faithful to Jesus. Andrew was on the cross for 4 days, speaking in great length with a remarkable power, and goes on at length that his soul is speeding home to its true Father, that he is sailing past desires, and encourages others to sail with him onto the blue. In the martyrdom narratives, it is difficult to distinguish a historical fact from a devotion legend. Are they true? We don't really have an answer absolutely. Did they occur, or how did they occur? The best that we can ever do is offer reconstructions of history, and so we do know that elements of legend did creep in the telling of stories. Although it must be considered speculative, popular tradition holds that following James's beheading in Jerusalem, 10 apostles, including Peter and Paul, died violent martyr's death. Thomas was tortured in India with a red-hot plate and pierced by 4 spears. Philip was crucified in Turkey. Jude was slain with a battle axe, along with Simon, who was cut to pieces. Matthew was brutally murdered while celebrating the Lord's Supper. Matthias was killed in Ethiopia. James the Less may have been thrown from the temple in Jerusalem and stoned to death, and Bartholomew skinned alive in Armenia. In undergoing a usually violent death and execution, the apostles are imitating Jesus Christ, who also underwent a similar fate, and the imitation of Christ was so important for Christian piety or through Christian history that the apostles have played such a role as well. Some sketchy historical evidence exists for Peter and Paul dying in Rome during the first official persecution of Christians. It began the year 64 under Emperor Nero. Towards the end of his life, he started having the reputation of getting a little crazy, Ancient Roman historians tell us that Nero actually set fire to a portion of the city of Rome and blamed it on Christians. They were thought of as very strange people. They were considered a superstition because they didn't accept the Roman gods. They only worshipped their one God and their one Savior, Jesus. As Nero decided to make a big spectacle to show these Christians a lesson, and so apparently there were wild beasts and dogs unleashed. There were crucifixions that were scheduled and occurred, and Christians dressed in flammable clothes and set on fire. Whether or not Peter and Paul were among them was not specifically listed. If they were there at the time in the area, chances are very good that they were included in the persecutions. In the apocryphal Acts of Peter, the apostle is converting Roman wives when their angry husbands complain to the Roman governor. Peter's death is ordered. Peter is about to leave Rome because the church urges him to do so. They think he's going to be arrested and executed imminently. They tell him to flee, and as he is on his way out of Rome, he meets Jesus. And he asks Jesus, "Where are you going?" And he asks Jesus, "Where are you going, my Lord?" And Jesus looks at him and says, "I'm going to Rome to be crucified again." Then Peter recognizes that Jesus is symbolically saying to him that he, Peter, is going to undergo martyrdom and will imitate Christ in following him in martyrdom. Peter turns around and goes back into Rome. Peter asked to be crucified upside down because he doesn't feel worthy of being crucified in the same way as Jesus. After declaring his love for Jesus, whom he calls my everything, Peter dies. Nero is responsible for Paul's death in apocryphal Acts of Paul. Paul says Christ will come, his king will come, he will destroy all the kingdoms, including you and yours. Nero then decides that he must do away with Paul and has him beheaded, but instead of blood coming out of the wound, milk flows, which symbolically would mean Paul was nurturing his church like his children. According to Christian apocrypha, Apostle John and Mary Magdalene were spared torturous death. Mary Magdalene lived out the rest of her life in the desert as a hermit, hardly recognizable anymore as the woman very famous for her sanctity. When she died and they retrieved her body, it was discovered she was a woman and was indeed the saint. John died natural causes at about age 100 in Ephesus, Turkey, at the close of the first century. His last words to his disciples was said to have been, "Little children, love one another," by depicting one of Jesus' own disciples and a beloved one at that, dying of old age without a martyr's death demonstrates to the reader that they can be witnesses to Jesus without martyrdom. There was an apocryphal story added to the Acts of John that his grave in Ephesus was one in which he was actually dead and sleeping, and that when he breathed, dust will come out of his tomb, and that anybody who took this dust and mixed it with water and drank it would be healed. The concept that tombs, bones, and relics of the apostles could transmit healing or holy power was accepted by Christians perhaps as early as the 2nd century, and they began to revere the remains of the apostles. The idea of a holy being part of the physical body of a saint's body is interesting and may not be easy for modern people to understand, but our physical contact with the holy was critical in the ancient world. Early Christians often built churches or monuments over the spot where the apostles were thought to have died or been entombed. In Rome, what many believe is the tomb of Peter lies beneath the most famous apostolic monument, St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. Built in the 16th century to replace an earlier 4th century structure, it may be Christendom's holiest shrine. It is one of the grandest churches on earth, proclaiming Peter's presence for miles around as the first bishop of Rome. The Vatican is really important in Christian history. It began as a monument to the death of the apostle, and in that sense, it was a very holy place for the early time in Christianity. 2000 years after the apostle's death, Christians are still in awe of their holy power. By the year 300 AD, Christianity had spread over the entire Mediterranean basin, from Rome to Carthage, Athens to Alexandria, and throughout Asia Minor. Despite Roman persecution, the foundation of Christian church created by the apostles remained strong. The apostles of supreme importance for the early church in the sense that they continued with Jesus Christ, and they provide a center of authority that the church can rest on. Churches are built on the foundation of the prophecy of the apostles. Later in the 4th century, no less than Constantine, the Roman emperor himself, converted to Christianity, a momentous occasion that may well have stunned even the apostles had they lived to see it. Toleration of Christianity became the norm, and by the year 325 AD, the religion of which the apostles fought so hard and gave their lives had become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. Massive numbers of people converted and began to learn what Christianity was and accepted, and truly this was the beginning of the explosive phase of growth. Today, 2 billion people, nearly 1/3 of the world's population, are Christians. The essentials of their doctrine derive from the teaching of the apostles. The New Testament is the most frequently published and mostly widely read book in history. At its center are the 4 Gospels that relate the story of Jesus' life and teaching. While biblical scholars continue to debate who wrote them, in the 2nd century, authorship of the Gospel began to be attributed to the apostles Matthew and John, to Mark, the disciple of Peter, and to Luke, a disciple of Paul. The New Testament is a crystallization of the apostolic tradition, where several people wrote down the teachings and actions of Jesus so that they have been passed on from generation to generation for 2,000 years. What has not changed much in 20 centuries is the discord caused by the breach in which faith between Christians and Jews. The apostles suffered greatly from the tensions between their faith in Jesus and the verdict of the religious authorities that Jesus was a criminal. In the New Testament, Paul admitted that this division cost him the stress, a sentiment that is echoed by some, but not all the contemporary Jews. On the one hand, you would have the ultra-Orthodox community that continues that kind of attitude towards Jesus in terms of looking at him as somebody who is one of our own, and split off and founded the church, and the church is looked at as enemy, of course. On the other hand, we have the more mainstream and liberal Jewish communities that are now in the post-Holocaust era, very interested in the cooperation with the churches and also interested in learning more about Jesus and his followers and how this whole split between Christianity and Judaism became possible. Diversity is characteristic among some 20,000 worldwide Christian denominations that today honor the memory of the apostles in different ways. For Catholics, the apostles still play a very important role as guardians of tradition. Of course, the entire point of the papacy is that it is a direct linear descent of leaders of the Roman Church from Peter. In contrast, Peter's brother, the Apostle Andrew, is revered as the founder of the Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. The Catholics and the Orthodox have basically held their center in those countries that revere the apostles as their founders, and they also have a cult of saints that are very important to them. So in Roman Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches, there is a special reverence given to the apostles that one would not find within the more secularized Protestant churches. In Protestant churches, the apostles are revered because they are biblical characters. They are the people we look to as having written the books of the Bible, but we don't ascribe to them any special sainthood. From a cult of outlaws to cultural icons, the apostles' notoriety hasn't diminished over time. They are a topic of media scrutiny, the subject of music composition, and a great art. Their names grace schools, hospitals, and churches. Christians are still moved by the example of the apostles' lives and their message of redemption. Modern-day pilgrims from around the world trek to the Holy Land of Israel to touch hallowed grounds where the 12 walked with Jesus. They wade in the water in which the miraculous catch of fish turned the apostles into fishers of men. They offer prayers on the spot where Peter, James, and John clinched the divinity of Jesus, and they revere the place where the apostles spent their last moments with the Son of God. The apostles made a profound effect in the world by the way in which they lived up to their names as apostles to be sent out. They did go out and spread the word of Jesus Christ, his life and ministry, and that made a profound difference in the lives of the people that heard their stories. The apostles, ordinary men called to greatness, overcame selfishness and fear to create a religious revolution, one that continues to unfold some 2,000 years after it first began. That is the end.